Hello, everyone. We're so happy to have you here today. My name is Christy Kelly. I'm the director of the Norin Center for Disability, Sonoran Center, Native Center for Disabilities. There we go. And we are very fortunate to have Dr. Darold Joseph with us today. He is an assistant professor in educational specialties department at Northern Arizona University. He is Coyote Clan from the Hopi village of Lower Moen Kopi. His father and aunties are Snow Clan from Shungopavi village. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Specialties and Teaching and Learning in the College of Education at NAU, as I mentioned. His research is informed from his experience serving as an educator in special education and focused on the intersection of disability with socio-cultural differences that inform educational inequities for American Indian and Alaskan Native youth. His work aims to advance opportunities for individuals with disabilities to persist in education, health, and wellness and cultural well-being through the lens of resilience. We are so lucky to have Dr. Joseph here today. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Let me get this technical stuff situated. Let me share my screen, and if someone can give me a thumbs up to let me know they see my screen. Yeah, okay, great. And then let me do one more thing here. Okay, awesome. This is perfect. All right, it's koi. Pai lumata lang vai piu tawan na sapti. Tanga pe is kwa pai ovin highlight te uma yep so bio yep piu tavalto te pai is kwa. I'm grateful for this beautiful day and very happy to be here with all of you. Thank you for the invitation to be a presenter as part of these series of webinars hosted by the Native Center for Disabilities. It's an honor and a pleasure to share this space with you today, so thank you. In the same vein that Christy had shared the land acknowledgement for the region in Southern Arizona, I'd like to do the same here where I'm located. This picture you see behind me is at the village of Munkapi, but you know, the wonders of technology, I can make it look like I'm there, but I'm actually in Flagstaff, Arizona. And so here, we're in Navatikiauovi, the San Francisco Peaks. They center the lands on which we live and where our Tetukaiki sits, which is the Northern Arizona University. This land, Ititskwa, on which our Hisat Sinom, our Hopi ancestors, have lived, is memorialized by our landmarks and sacred shrines, such as the Pueblo Ruins, Waputki, Walnut Canyon, the Grand Canyon, and many others throughout the region. With our relatives from the Diné, the Havasupai, Paiute, and the many other indigenous relatives of this sacred land, we continue to live and thrive. Let us honor, respect, and not forget the breaths of life taken and lived by our ancestors of this sacred place. Let us draw strength from knowing and respecting the stories of this land to contribute to and to build community resilience and well-being among colleagues, students, and the extended community in which we live. Kwakwa, thank you. Okay, so let's get this party started, huh? It's so wonderful to be here with you. Those of you who have been to some of my previous presentations know that I often present through storying. And so I am planning to do that today with limited amount of slides, with limited amount of bullets, and rather presenting pictures to support the words I will share with you today. So let me go ahead and get started. And I already kind of fell off my marker. This is the San Francisco Peaks. that was supposed to be showing when I read that land acknowledgement, and I already lost my track, but Jim earlier was saying that's the golf course in front of the San Francisco Peaks, but it's not. So, I want to start with Itam Hakako. Where are we from? And as I start to speak here, I invite every one of you to use the Zoom chat box to introduce yourselves in relation to where you are coming, the roles that you hold in your respective communities and organizations, and just anything that you would like to share with the community that we have here with us today. Okay. Nesela yan matiwa puna iswangwa namunkapi ank sino. I am the one they call breathing in the snow. Sila, from the water coyote clan of the village of Munkapi, the place where the water flows. And you see the village right up in that upper right-hand corner there. I have to warn you though, if you ever are in Munkapi, in the Munkapi area and refer to me by my Hopi name, my Coyote clan sisters would not distinguish me so eloquently. They would say, Silla, do you mean slurp? Humor. You gotta love it. I prefer breathing in the snow. My father and my aunts are from the Snow Clan, from the village of Sangopavi. And so in this slide, I show pictures of my village, Munkapi, one of our Ba Iswangwa relatives, the water coyote, standing, looks like on the ice of a river. And then the questioning of, what do I prefer based on context? One who breathes in the snow or slurp? So let me go here. So the purpose of my presentation today is to uphold and support the ways in which our Native American communities honor and validate the acts of self-determination by our youth. And when I speak of youth, I mean all our youth. And hopefully by the end of today, we leave here with some examples of transcending Western constructions of disability to honor the human dimensions of our youth through peoplehood. You see, our uncle, Dr. Tom Home, and some of you may know him, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and of the Muskogee descent, offers us a lens to conceptualize dimensions of peoplehood by understanding the interconnected and interdependent living relationships that exist between language, sacred history, place and territory, ceremonial cycles. But before we get further into discussing this, I think it is important to recognize and honor what has already been shared by relatives in prior webinars. And that is the term disability is not part of the lexicon of many Indigenous communities. It just does not translate or just does not exist. I've had many conversations with relatives from my Hopi community and those from other tribal communities about the term, and to date have not come across a single term that is used. Instead, this inquiry has led to storying with my relatives, storying about the perspectives, the beliefs, the values, the histories, the understandings and explanations of our origins as human beings, all for the purpose to understand current circumstances, providing direction for our journeys forward. So as a means to further understand how peoplehood can be used as a tool to elevate self-determination of our youth, I share a story from my history of working in the field. So I guess that means that I should probably share a bit about what working in the field means for me. I shared parts of this when I presented the keynote address at the Disability Summit in April. A wonderful event, by the way. So I apologize for the repetition, but staying true to the profession, and as they say in education, repetition is good, something our elders would say as well. In addition to being the one who breathes in the snow, depending on who you ask, from the village of Munkapi, I am also an assistant professor at the NAU College of Education in the Educational Specialties Department, where my primary focus is special education. Before that, though, I was a vocational rehabilitation specialist under the leadership of Dr. Lee Geshiama for the American Indian Vocational Rehabilitation Training and Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as ARTAC, also located here at Northern Arizona University. Then before this, I was a special education director for the Hopi Junior Senior High School. Go Bruins! I know some of you, I think I see a Bruin on the webinar with us today. And before that, I served as a special education teacher, coordinator for a K-6 elementary school at Second Mesa Day School. Go Bobcats! But even before that, I was and still am the younger sibling to Ipava, my older brother, who lives with multiple disabilities, and also a son and still am to my mother and father, which my mother happens to be a retired special education teacher. I spent a bit of time sharing the story about my family's experience with limited access to educational resources for my brother and the tough decision made by my parents, ultimately leading to my brother spending the majority of his adolescent life attending the ASDB residential school in Tucson, Arizona. The presentation is posted on the Disability Summit YouTube channel, I believe, so you can find it there if you're interested in hearing that presentation. So as we move forward, I do want to focus on my time spent working in the schools. On the Hopi homelands, as during this time as a Hopi educator, I was aspiring to fulfill the saying of go and pursue your education and then return home to advocate for your people. I'm sure I'm not alone in hearing this message. This was one of those moments in my life that I can truly reflect on and say I could identify components of peoplehood in full action, not only for myself, but for the students that I served as a Hopi special education teacher and for the community we came from. I could see it, hear it, feel it, breathe it. So in the fall, as exactly around this time, as a matter of fact, and because Hopis are farmers, fall harvest celebrations were taking place in many of our 12 villages. For the students I taught, that meant for them returning home after school for a brief period of time. Then leaving to congregate at the kivas or ceremonial chambers where they learned the songs and dances for weeks until all this effort culminated in a beautiful ceremony of 2 full days of dancing with a display of Hopi traditional dress and vibrant colors. It was during these 2 days in which the singers made up of grandfathers, fathers, uncles, and brothers of all ages that I took notice of a clan brother who was dressed with a bright yellow scarf tied around his forehead and a beautiful ribbon shirt and Hopi totsis or Hopi moccasins. He was about 12 years age or so and also had Down syndrome. I too was participating as one of the singers during the 2-day celebration. As we would return to the resting place and huddle around the drummer to rehearse the songs for the next performance in the village plaza, my clan brother, with each return to the resting place, moved from the outside of this huddle closer and closer to the center of the huddle with his rattle in hand until he was seated next to the drummer himself. You see, he was determined to eventually find himself next to the drummer. All the while, I with my curiosity and positionality as a special education teacher anxiously awaited in anticipation of what was to come next. As the drummer drummed, leading the rhythm of the song, the young boy shook his rattle in unison, then looked at his rattle, just like this, looked at his rattle, looked into the drummer's eyes, then looked at his drumstick, and then methodically and peacefully and harmoniously exchanged the rattle and the drumstick between his and the drummer's hand, and he continued to drum and lead the singers with the song. It was beautiful. See, in that moment was the expression of peoplehood. It was at its finest, language spoken in all its vernaculars, history told in all its dimensions, land and place contextualizing reality in its many forms, and ceremony being lived and expressed in its many cycles. In this very moment, the braids of this experience demonstrated in a significant way the interdependent and interrelated relationships that tell the story of leveraging the self-determination of a young man to lead. You see, the context and conditions that exist in my story represent peoplehood in ways that elevate self-determination for youth to lead. This is not unique to the Hopi community. These contexts and conditions exist in various forms for all 576 federally recognized tribes. Particularly as we consider the representation of those of you participating today, I encourage you to consider the ways in which the hats you wear with respect to professional roles, community roles, family roles, play a part with contributing to the self-determination of our youth. I say this because experiences like the one shared forced me to examine my own positionality, particularly as it related to the roles I held as a community member and educator. The confluence of these roles required constant attention to carefully navigate these complex spaces to cultivate and leverage self-determination for the students I served. It's not the easiest thing to do. I can only imagine that most, if not all of you participating today have encountered this too. Entangled in the process for me, though, was the return home. Proud to have completed college, equipped with the tools to advocate for my people through the embodiment of an educator and the praxis of the profession of a special educator. In other words, I was a good special education teacher, and a damn good one at that, with implementing policy and practice in the name of special education. But experiences like the one shared reminded me of how the transitions in my own thinking were necessary to move from the mindset of just being an educator to becoming a Hopi educator. This was important for the purpose of presenting the ways in which opportunities existed in the path ahead for youth coming from the community. And the picture that you see here depicts a translation from a cultural lens, the interpretation of choices presented before youth, including work, training, cultural responsibilities, opportunities through joining the military, going to community college, artists being self-employed, perhaps going to the university, and the reality of alcohol and drugs and not knowing what lies in the path ahead. My hope today is that we get the sense of how we might use peoplehood to navigate the spaces of transition in our own thinking to then serve as allies for our Indigenous youth. This is important to me because I believe we have to continue and to strive to be conscientious of the critical orientations of our own positionalities and how these orientations positively and negatively influence our intentions to do well and to grow from the experiences that teach us otherwise. The way I understand it is doing this work signifies my relationality to place, to land, to history, to language, and to ceremony. It informs my peoplehood, my sense of belonging to community. Not only that, it has braided my experiences throughout my life, consistently teaching me the value of community. And thus, to this point, I've attempted to limit my use of the term disability to reflect and honor the strength and resilience of all our Indigenous youth through the lens of peoplehood. So I turn now to another example of peoplehood. I've been so blessed and honored in my journey to be educated and positively influenced by the people that I met along the path. A couple of those individuals included Ivy Sania, who you see standing here in the picture, and her mother, Madeline Sania. A few years back, this was maybe about 6 years ago, we had collaborated with Ivy and Madeline and a few other community members to create digital stories about resilience. And I want to share that with you now. And we will share this video and then come back to providing an update of what Ivy's story has to tell us.
Come to think of it, there actually isn't a single.
Okay, stop share. Okay, here we go. Oops.
Email that I've written over the last few months without the help of Grammarly. Grammarly is
And before I move on, the majority of this video will be silenced. Ivy had selected to present it this way. She is a person who experienced living with deafness and does everything through American Sign Language. What a beautiful story, huh? Beautiful story shared by Ivy, and a powerful one at that. You know, and it took just simply providing the space and the resources to share and hear the story. And since this time, as you can see, it was published here on YouTube in 2015. Since that time, Ivy has graduated from Gallaudet University and is now a night supervisor at ASDB. And since 2019 has volunteered her time as an assistant coach for the ASDB high school track team. When I was able to catch up with her in March of this year, I asked Ivy and asked her how her story might cultivate self-determination and community advocacy in Indigenous communities for those living with disabilities. And here is what she had to say. Verbatim is what she wrote to me. Yes, that is accessible jobs, transportations, and places for Indigenous people and people with disabilities. Accessibility, what we need, have sidewalks with lights, streets, etc. On any reservation, that is important to keep Indigenous people to stay safe. We also need to have places such as houses, apartments, trailers, etc. for people with disabilities, which they can be independent and have experience which their family do not have to take care of them. Actually, we need more jobs, especially need to hire people with disabilities with full-time jobs, which is important for them to have experience. Actually, we need to have transportation that would help people with disabilities to learn to be independent, which they can go to work from their place, or they can shop at any store or eat at any restaurant. Ivy went on to share a message with the Indigenous youth living living with disabilities, and encourage others to say, to make your own digital stories to share with your people and other communities, what we need to hear, what we need to change. Don't let anything stop you as your disabilities, because you will get successful if you get a job, a place, or go to college. Make sure you will have support and advocacy from your family. So, you know, I still, every time I watch and hear and learn from Ivy, I'm learning something new. I'm growing in the process, and reflect in the ways that it might inform my engagements as I continue to do this work. And Ivy's story and the words she shared are representations of self-determination that are connected to peoplehood. And as part of her parting message, she left us with the question, could you live in my world? You see, I think in a beautiful way, she juxtaposed her lived experience with that of her audience, pushing us to consider a counter-narrative and interpretation of self-determination and resilience. And in her message, she weaves in the opportunities waiting to be discovered through the acts of building alliances. So today, I follow Ivy's lead. Thank you, Ivy, in suggesting to use the framework of peoplehood to position ourselves to recognize the assets of Indigenous youth and the communities they come from, and use these assets to inform every aspect of building community and providing opportunities. We know all too well about what my colleague and friend, Dr. Alfredo Artiles, refers to as the paradox of educational equity. In other words, good intentions with unintended consequences, or systemic disparities existing, such as disproportionality when examining along the lines of race and ethnicity in the representation of students of color in special education disability categories, or considering the limitations of discretionary funding for tribal vocational rehabilitation programs, when there are 576 federally recognized tribes and only 96 federally funded tribal VR programs across 26 states. These conditions shape experiences and outcomes for Native American youth. So, thinking about the road ahead, it's time that we do the work to reframe the narrative and leverage assets. Leverage the funds of knowledge and account for the rich diversity among our Indigenous youth to validate their acts of self-determination and use this to give us strength, or as I call it, nohongvita. To wrestle with the tensions that exist in the lexicons of our communities and institutions where peoplehood and disability meet, let's continue to do this work with good intentions. And so with that, I leave you with the model of Nahonglita, depicting the work of the communities we come from, the primary home communities, providing cultural models for many of our Indigenous students, and the work that they engage in as they transition to these secondary home environments to build community and using history to inform that process. And through this, they build the strength and resilience needed to succeed. So thank you for your time. I appreciate all of you. I appreciate your introductions. I see that many of you are coming from various locations, representing various programs across the state of Arizona, out of the state of Arizona, coming from the Hopi community. Hello, Elise, I see you. You know, and working in various dimensions. And so with that said, I want to leave time and an opportunity for each of us to engage in dialogue and comment and ask questions and continue this conversation as we move forward. So if I may, I would like to turn it back to the audience and our moderator, perhaps to facilitate a question and answer period. And as I'm doing that, I will end show. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Darold. So we will open it up now for questions. You can raise your hand by clicking on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll unmute you and you can ask your questions. You're also welcome to pose questions in the chat.
You know what would be really fun for me is if I could see all of your beautiful faces. If you have the capabilities to turn on your video, I'm sure we would all be grateful for seeing the peoplehood that exists out there in virtual land. It's good to see everyone. Hi, Debbie. Hi, Kim. Hi, Tess, Norma, Lisa, Pam, Elise, Tamika, Amy, Lynn, Rosalie, Elizabeth, Pam, Alicia, Fiona, Cliff, Shauna. I'm just calling out the videos that come on as I see them. Hi, Amanda. Hi, Nellie, Amber, Desiree, Leanne. Takia. So the floor is yours. You know, I know we have a wealth and funds of knowledge coming from the audience who is in attendance today. And I hope that you've also been able to make some connections to some of the concepts presented today. And, you know, obviously there is plenty more work to do on behalf of the community. And so I want to leave this time open for you to share your comments or ask any questions.
So we have our first hand raised.
Yeah.
Tess, I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute. You can ask your question.
Well, it's not a question, but more of an observation. A lot of times in my meetings, when I have a meeting, I notice things are entirely different for the person that I'm supposed to be working with compared to other people's perspectives of them. Primary example, I was recently in a meeting where 25-year-old member, diagnosis of cerebral palsy and intellectual disability. Everybody around him would treated him not if he was invisible, but inconsequential. But he would drop comments into conversations that were appropriate to what was being discussed. They would be, and they would make people laugh, and they would ignore him after that because they didn't believe he understood what he was saying. They just thought he was saying something. And that's the comments I got for the meeting that's how I was prepared for him when I went to the meeting. That's what I was told to expect from him. And when I went to the meeting and I was talking and doing the meeting, I found out that this young man, this 25-year-old man, was actually quite brilliant, because I actually talked to him, with him. And if I hadn't actually interacted with him, if I had believed what the notes said, honestly, as a result of the meeting, his needs and everything have been completely reworked. He's going to be taking his GED so that he can go to college for the robotics and engineering that he wants to do. And I'm sitting here going, why didn't anybody notice? What did we miss? And listening to Dr. Joseph and what he's saying, I think we missed the personhood. I think we totally missed the personhood. We got into a habit of bias, of normalcy bias. This is what he was like as a kid, so this is what he's always going to be like. So I'm wondering, is there anything that you would think that we could introduce that would help remind people of the personhood of our members?
Great share, Tess. I appreciate you sharing your experience, and I'm willing to bet that many of you through your various respective locations have had similar experiences. I've had the same experiences. And for me, and I'm speaking based on my experience, and I welcome others to share their recommendations and thoughts and responses for tests. But really, I think, we get so involved, and I speak about this in my presentation and others, this idea that the essence of normalcy comes from the structures that we operate within, right? And as we think about that, for me, that existed in learning the skills and abilities to become a special education teacher. And as I returned home, what that meant for me was a couple of things that were juxtaposed. One was that I was returning home, which made me proud to give back to my community, right? Because this was a cultural value for me. But the other side of that, although I came back in the role of being the Hopi educator, in very, very early on in my career, I did not understand how important, even for me, coming from the community, that I could possess some of my own implicit biases. And understanding that because of that, I may not listen as well as I need to within my own community and make assumptions that on behalf of the students that I served. And it wasn't until, as you mentioned, really listening, paying attention, giving the attention, and finding opportunities to advocate, creating the spaces for the stories to play a role in decision-making as we develop programming. And so it really, I think, essentialized my role, as I mentioned in the presentation, the importance of being conscious about how these structures implicitly can lay out foundations for constructing interactions that promote or perpetuate this idea of otherness, right? And so we may mean well, but also sometimes there are unintended consequences. And the more that we can become familiar and aware of the context and the conditions that may perpetuate those circumstances for ourselves and the students we're serving, the better off we are for it, because we're holding ourselves accountable to recognize that and then to change the narrative, right? I think Ivy did the same thing in her story, and she tells the story of not being heard, right, in her IEP meetings and continually being told about her abilities, without her own voice being involved in that. And demonstrating levels of self-advocacy to finally say, I need more, and then eventually transitioning down to ASDB. And seeing the story that blossomed from that, right? Going to Gallaudet, independently living, and then presenting also, again, these complexities that exist for Indigenous students to understand what does it mean when we consider serving our Indigenous students from an Indigenous lens with the value of peoplehood, and understanding this diversity that exists as we think about things such as Native youth coming from rural communities and Native youth living in urban communities, and what that means for accessibility, right? So I think, as we're moving through these spaces, it's important for us, especially for those of us working in organizations intended to create equity and access for our students. These are things we need to have to consider, right? How well are we listening? How well are we incorporating those dimensions of peoplehood, to understand the languages of the individuals themselves, to understand the ceremonies they come from, to understand the land and the territories they come from, to understand the histories that come with them, in developing services and programs. And so I think that's a very important piece of, what I hope that we can all walk away with today in terms of understanding what that might mean for us as we go back to the spaces we're coming from. So thank you, Tess.
We can continue to take some questions while
we have a
folks
few
may be
minutes.
thinking. You do have some just comments in the chat as well, just thanking you for sharing the stories and that you're an amazing breath of fresh air and that your students are
Thank
blessed
you.
to have you. All right, Agnes, I will ask you to unmute and you can ask your question.
Hi, this is Agnes Atakai from the College of
Hey,
Public
Agnes.
Health. And my question, so my question is, I've noticed a trend that, we have support services for students while they're in high school and graduating, but what type of services are available to our Native students when they want to advance into college or want to go into a career? I've heard that comments from other folks. I've had two of my cousins go to ASDB and they graduated, but now they ended up going back home because they needed folks to help care for them. They've been both visually impaired. What support services do we offer our students if they want to go into a career? And is there opportunities for folks to collaborate in making sure that they have, I guess, a network or services available for them to engage in conversation and continue to support each other on tribal reservations, maybe through a chat service? Because I tend to chat a lot with my cousins. They have ability to use voice-enabled services, but other than that, they feel disconnected and they feel there was a lost opportunity for any kind of careers for them, and they fear that when their parents go, who's going to help support them as they get older? So those are the things that have been brought up to me. Thanks.
Well, that's a huge question, and there are, I think, multiple ways to approach it, and I open that up. I think probably one of the most immediate ways we can get responses is by asking many of you who are coming from places like the Division of Developmental Disabilities. I see folks from vocational rehabilitation. I don't know if we have folks from the Centers for the ILCs on here. Obviously the Sonoran USAID. This is the intent of this, the Native Center for Disabilities, is to address these concerns, Agnes, and it's so good to hear your voice. Thank you so much. Agnes made a baby blanket for one of our girls, by the way, so we know Agnes very well. But these are very important questions, and I think things that we need to consider as we think about, the roles that we have in relation to the federally recognized tribes within, well, at least within the state of Arizona, but also across the nation. And there's a huge disparity that exists, Agnes, I think, in the partnerships, programs, and opportunities that can help in this transition from those home communities into locations like such as your cousins were wanting to maintain to maintain a sense of independent living. And oftentimes these organizations are not speaking together. And this is my observation, right? Often, and it's not to the fault of anyone, but I think it's also a need for us to address that conversations do need to happen within our Indigenous communities about transition after high school. I worked in tribal VR and worked with several programs to talk about, or ask the question, have you reached out to the local high school? Have you incorporated practices and processes where you're making regular visits to orientate to the local high school population about those next steps? And almost often the response would be not as much as we should, or we haven't thought about that. And so as part of tribal VR and providing technical assistance, it was our role to say, well, let's get that started. Let's go to the high school, meet with administrators, and develop a memorandum of understanding between the tribal VR program, the state VR programs, and the high school to make this a regular event that VR programs come into the high school, specifically presenting to our students in receiving special education services. And so, that requires the need really to examine and leverage what the language is in policy. So looking at IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and what we see in that as it pertains to transition. Looking at Section 504, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act, to see where in the language space and opportunities are presented to create this partnership, right? We have national technical assistance centers that are funded through the Rehabilitation Service Administration that are very targeted on serving specific communities. And in some ways, it very much isolates groups of people such as Indigenous people who may also need that resource, but because they're not under the purview of the defined parameters of the service population, groups of people are left out, right? So we have to have these conversations, and it starts small, it starts locally, and it starts with becoming that advocate, right? To hear the story, what are the absences? And so, Agnes, I would recommend following up with the Sonoran you said, and the Native Center for Disability, because I believe they're developing a wonderful list of resources that exist to address circumstances that your cousins are currently experiencing. Because think about that, so much self-determination exists in what they're sharing with you, right? And think about the opportunities that can be. But we need to move that conversation forward and connect them to the resources that are there and available. And I think that says a lot also for our tribal VR programs, our tribal schools, to also understand their roles in creating these pathways, right? And so how do we identify one another so that we can have these conversations, create those spaces? So thank you, Agnes. I appreciate the question. And I know we're at 1 o'clock. I'm glad I left about 20 minutes at the end, but feel free to follow up. I'm here at Northern Arizona University, and my contact information will be there with the Center for the Native Center for Disabilities. And thank you to the Sonoran USAID and to Jim and the rest of the team there for inviting me today.
Palamia, Darold, we really appreciate it. And when we saw you at the summit, we really liked your presentation. And it's wonderful that you are able to apply the cultural aspects into your work, into the school systems, so that there's a balance between the two systems so it works for those young ones. And from the traditional aspects that you shared, it is what we call in our non-Indian world, the student-centered or person-centered approach. And that's what we want to continue with, maybe applying some of these cultural aspects into your toolkit so that you can better serve our young ones, in this case, with disabilities in our schools. So again, please send us your information and other resources. That's exactly what Dr. Joseph shared, is we want to be able to share all these resources available to our communities out there in Indian country. And to our non-native allies, thank you for joining us and doing the work that you do to better the services for Indian country. We really need you as our, what I like to call allies. So thank you for the work you're doing. Next month is my brother, Dr. Don Warren, and he will be discussing medical and public health aspects and impacts to Indian country and disability. So join us next month, October 14. I believe it will be on our website here shortly, so you can register next month. So thank you for joining us today. Christy or JC, did I miss anything for closing today?
I just want to add, we want to thank the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. It's through their funding support that we're able to have this webinar series, this monthly series. And if we didn't get to your question or something else comes up, I put contact information in the chat for the Native Center. You can direct those to Christy. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. And please complete our evaluation. We really look at that feedback, and it also helps us identify future speakers.
Yes,
So
as
thank you
JC
for your
said,
time.
yes, thank you for joining us, because JC has mentioned we really want your feedback so that we can kind of gear our webinars and other trainings to meet your needs as well. So share whatever you have, and we will definitely utilize that information. So thank you, JC. And Christy, anything before we leave today?
No, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Palamia. And again, send your information and we'll see you next month. Take care and keep making a difference.
Thank you, everyone.